Okay, in section 2, we are going to be discussing sexual orientation and homosexuality in a little more detail. So, sexual orientation is the degree of stable emotional and erotic attraction that an individual has to either an individual of the same sex. We consider that to be homosexuality. The prefix homo means same. Or the opposite sex, that's heterosexuality, hetero meaning the opposite. They may be attracted to both sexes. This is bisexuality, or person considered bisexual. Some people are attracted to neither sex, and they're considered asexual. Or people who are attracted to people of all sexes, gender, and gender identities, they are considered to be pansexual. There are some other terms out there that kind of are coming into usage. So I didn't include those, not to say that they're not valid, but just to say that these are the most common categories that you'll hear. Sexual orientation is quite stable. It is not a phase that people go through. It can take a while for a person to identify what their sexual orientation is, especially due to cultural and religious upbringings. But people generally, once they have decided or kind of understand where they lie with their sexual orientation, it is stable. Research on where sexual orientation comes from, it's estimated to be between 30 to 70% genetic across various research. But that is a ton of variability, so it's really not well understood. If you'd like to take this test from the Kinsey Institute, which is an important institute that studies sexuality and sexual health and sexual behaviors in adults, you can take this test. The QR code is there on the right, and it will kind of pinpoint what your sexual orientation might be. When we look at the rates of sexuality or sexual orientations, we look at the differences between men and women. Most men and most women identify as heterosexual, although that does seem to be shifting. Originally, the book quotes a study from Bogert in 2006, and you can see that homosexuality in men was estimated to be about 3.5%, and for women at 1.8%. But as you can see in 2017, those numbers had shifted and gone up a bit, especially in women. I think this is due in part to a greater cultural acceptance and a cultural awareness of what homosexuality is. And, 2006, this was way before it was legal for same-sex marriages to take place across the country. It was only legal in a handful of states. So we have seen a really big shift in understanding of an acceptance of homosexuality. Bisexuality, again, was around 1% for men and 1% for women, but that has increased dramatically, especially in women. Asexuality seems to have remained stable. And then transgender is about 0.6% of individuals. That's men and women combined. And again, that's from the 2017 data. I couldn't find anything else that was more updated as of this point. But I would expect that you would see these shifts to be larger. Now, you might be thinking, like, wow, like of my friends or of people I know, it seems to be a lot higher than the percentages that you're seeing here. But again, you got to understand that you guys are from a much younger generation where homosexuality and sexual orientations other than heterosexual is a lot more well understood. It's a lot more acceptable, and we live in a part of the country where having different sexual orientation other than heterosexual is considered to be an okay thing in most families. So it's something that I think you're going to see increasing dramatically over the next few years as you adolescents become adults. So if we look at sexual orientation and where it comes from, is it biologically determined? We really don't know exactly kind of where it comes from. It's definitely something that like people don't just decide like, oh, I have decided that I'm going to be homosexual. Like, people will say that all the time. They'll ask like a question like that. Oh, when did you decide to be homosexual? And it's like, no, it's like, when did you decide to be heterosexual? It's not really the right question. But where does that come from? We're not exactly sure. They think it might be partially influenced by what we call the sexually antagonistic selection theory or epigenetics. So the sexually antagonistic selection theory suggests that genes are the same across both sexes, but they get expressed differently in males and females. And so sometimes those will shift you to having attraction for one sex over the other. Epigenetics is the gene expression during development, especially prenatal hormone exposure. That may shift how we develop interest in the opposite sex or same sex partners over time. So there could be some genetic and environmental interaction with that as well. When we look at homosexuality, it's important to kind of understand some basic facts. So, first of all, parenting does not make a child homosexual. By allowing little boys to dress in pink or wear dresses or play with dolls is not going to make them gay. Same thing with little girls playing with stereotypically boy toys is not going to make them lesbians. It's just not how that works. Children just are the way that they are. Homosexuals do face potential rejection by family and discrimination in hiring and housing practices. It is still a major issue even today across the country. So, like I said, it is legal across the United States for gay couples to marry in every single state. That was a Supreme Court case that was decided, I think it was back in 2015. It was relatively recent. However, in many states, sexual orientation and gender expression are still not protected classifications. So people can decide to not allow you to live in their apartment complex or to hire an individual or a couple because of their sexual orientation. So people can still be fired or rejected from housing or rejected from being hired at certain places. Homophobia is the prejudice, fear, and dislike that's directed towards homosexuals. And heterosexism is a belief that heterosexuality is better or more natural than homosexuality. The thing is that homosexuality has been around since the beginning of humanity. You guys probably learned in history class about the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks and their very open sexual expressiveness with people of all kinds of different sexualities. It wasn't really a big deal until a more modern era. Also, we see homosexual behaviors in many species across the animal kingdom. You probably have heard of the gay penguins that adopted an egg that had been rejected or abandoned by its heterosexual parents. There are gay lions, gay elephants. We've talked about bonobos and their sexual activity. They're very open and very fluid in their sexuality all throughout their lives. So it's really only us humans that seem to have a big problem with it. And much of the rejection that homosexuals face is based off the false stereotypes about gay and lesbian people. Now, here on the right is a picture of my sister and her wife when they got married. So just a little personal touch. I think this is a beautiful shot of my sister and her wife, so my sister-in-law. So some things you should know about homosexuality. So gay and lesbian people do not try to convert others to homosexuality. If they're able to convert you to homosexuality, it means that you were already gay to begin with. People who are homosexual are no more likely to molest children than heterosexuals. Actually, most child molesters are heterosexual men. We're going to talk about that later on in this chapter. They are no more likely to be mentally ill than heterosexuals. Any increased rates of mental illness in homosexuals is typically due to rejection from family and the community. When those things are accounted for, the mental illness rates are at a normal rate. They do not hate persons of the opposite sex. They do not, as parents, make their own children gay. They do have long-term, caring, monogamous relationships. They are no less able to contribute to society than heterosexuals, and they are in every country in the world. Despite the attempts of many governments and many cultures to reject or ignore or actively harm homosexual communities, they do exist in every country all over the world. So another thing you should understand is what's called asexuality. So people who are asexual don't experience sexual attraction. They may, in certain cases, still engage in sexual activity with a loving partner. They may choose to be married and be in relationships, but it just depends on the individual. Some people just have no desire for sexual activity, and that is a valid life choice. So some people who are kind of in the middle are considered to be what we call demisexual. And as it says here, they only experience sexual attraction after a strong emotional bond is established. Sexual attraction kind of comes secondary to the emotional connection. They oftentimes are, they refer to themselves as aces. If you ever hear that term, aces means an asexual individual. So oftentimes they will still be in relationships, just sexuality is not a primary focus for their, the terms of their relationships. All right, we're going to pause here, and then in our next section, we're going to be covering gender development and gender variations.